were 14 animal damage claims in 2019. Elk was 39. So, you know, the agricultural side of it, and when you look at how the pie charts are broken down with elk, the majority of it is native grass claims. You know, it's not necessarily cultivated. Maybe some of those lands are, but it's not alfalfa or corn.
Brian, you said Jim Schwartz was going to come on.
Jim McGagnon.
Yeah.
Jim McGagnon is working on some ideas that he wants to present to the group at the December meeting.
I've got another recommendation.
That was good.
Just to give.
You're pulling all these from what they do in other states too, right?
Similar theme, different topic. So we have damage claims and then we have coupons, landowner coupons that are turned. And so I would do a similar thing and say that would look at giving the commission the authority to issue Delphon or leftover tags to landowners in lieu of coupons. So what's that, a couple $1 million program? Not everybody can take that on. So rather than, if you decided to take those Delphon tags, you can't turn in then a number, and let that number be negotiated between the landowner and the department, make a recommendation. But again, it's just a way to try to help those landowners. Maybe they have the ability to monetize those. Right now, every time we pay one of those coupon tags, what is it reimbursement now? Almost the same price of a landlord.
17, right, Scott?
17 bucks.
$16. Yeah.
$16. And by the time you pay a resident license, it's 37, and you look at the differential. It's not a lot of money there, but maybe that would help ease some tension with landowners.
What are the coupons? Sorry, I'll be that person to ask the dumb question, because maybe I'm not
It's
the
just
only
called a
one.
landowner coupon. It's on every single carcass coupon license. And
Got it.
if a hunter takes an animal on private land, they can hand that coupon over to the landowner and they can send it into the department to get paid.
And they get paid for it. Got it. Thank you.
Brian, Tony asked me a good question. I have no clue. So, how many non-resident landowners apply for damages?
I have no clue either. Not very many.
Great question.
I would say that's a pretty low number. I'm sure there are some.
Is that something that's important to dig up the data
Well,
on, or is it just curiosity, or?
I mean, it's just.
I think it's just observance in my neck of the woods, not very many, and the ones that do are the ones that are actually got some cows on there, and they're actually trying to be involved in ag in some way, and at least they're making a go of putting some cows on there and raising hay and doing those kind of things that. But for the most part, like I say, they got, 2,000 head of elk on their property, and they don't care whether they're there or not. And so, and then you got the guy next door who is trying to make a living on their ranch. They don't have, I mean, they've been there forever and they're scratching out a living just like they always did. And yet the guy next door has all the elk. So even if you give them extra, if you give those resident landowners more tags or the historic rancher more tags, that's great, but he can't really kill anymore. He can't get any more elk because all the elk or all the deer are over on the neighbors. And so it's tough.
It's an interesting case in that situation where the non-resident landowner is providing lovely habitat and not worried about it, right?
Well, and he does. I mean, he may have a ranch manager or
Right.
an outfitter who allows people to come on and hunt, but
Right.
it's generally paid for. I mean, they under a fee and
Right.
and they get a quality hunt. And they might get a record bull or a big bull or
Right.
whatever. And he may allow some kids come in late in the season and hunt a few cows, and they take them out and get them set up. And
Right.
but as far as a fair chase and all of that,
Yeah.
there's a limit to that. And
Right.
so
Right.
I got another proposal.
What is it?
Non-resident guys, 2,000 elk, run over to the real family cattle rancher, destroy the fence and eat his haystack.
Right.
And then go back over it
Go back.
during the
Can they go
day.
back?
That happens.
That's a huge problem in Wyoming.
Larry, something else?
Just trying to come up with ideas to get public comment. So, any landowner that enrolled lands into the access yes program will transfer their current allocation of land.
So allow,
So incentivize those guys to get into access yes.
so allow access, yes, participants.
To transfer.
To transfer.
Transfer.
I think, to dovetail on what you're saying, Larry, about access, yes, you're gonna just try to seek public input. What do they think would help incentivize ranchers to participate? What other things are, because I think there are other things there. I think in addition to money, money is what Si said it was. We're not competing with the current market, whether it be an outfitter or be a landowner doing it himself. So when you lump outfitters, you also have to lump landowners in there who are outfitters themselves too. So it's not just some guy from somewhere else. It's all, they're trying to create a program that is not truly philanthropic, so to speak, because they're not really getting much out of the deal. We have a lot of people in access just now that are older ranchers, and the money's not as important, so it's more of a philanthropic type thing, and helping a fellow man go hunting or whatever. Well, when those guys pass on, maybe some younger guys are coming on in the families. Well, now it's a little more about that. So it's a constant struggle trying to keep people enrolled in land in access. Yes. I mean, I think there's other ways we can do that. I think there's things we can do. We can inventory their ranch and help them with cheatgrass and spurge and other different things, water development, whatever, all in exchange for access. Which if the guy came to my place and wanted to help with prairie dog control and a variety of different things there, I might be more inclined to do something than worried about what the check was. So if you're going to get information and get from the public, what are some ideas that may help access yes grow?
And you bring up a good point, Pete, because this is where this topic really will have a lot of overlap when we really get into the mule deer discussion. Especially I think the way you may have asked at the beginning, what stands out in the comments that Jim Schwartz had submitted. There's many stories like this around the state where he says here, there were no elk on this ranch in the mid-70s. We want to talk about solutions for mule deer. We want to really go down the road of talking about being a little more liberal with our harvest of elk populations. We're still going to run into the same roadblock of access. No matter what it looks like on paper, if we can't get sportsmen to those elk, we're not going to be able to put a dent in those populations to curb that robust growth that we have now. There is a lot of overlap.
We've got, people are thinking about how to incentivize more participation in access, yes, or otherwise encourage the landowners to allow that access, and not just for market incentives, but other ways that we can encourage that, knowing that a lot of our resident hunters in particular are not going to pay that top dollar for access fees. Besides, do you have another idea to add?
Going back to, what are some issues with access? Yes, there are some issues with it. And why do resident sportsmen want access to these pieces of ground over here? And it's a real simple deal in a lot of cases. This piece of ground over here has a lot of wildlife on it. And it's being managed properly and being hunted lightly. Therefore, it's really good hunting. So they want to hire my services together because I'm only going to kill 8 deer off that piece of ground. Consequently, right next door, there's an access yes program. The game fish does not do any sort of management as far as numbers other than the umbrella for that region. And you see it, we all see it. The place right next door that's under access yes management is shot to ribbons. And a lot of times virtually nothing is even on that piece of ground. So you guys, some of the dissatisfaction from the resident sportsmen, why they can't go over here. And we're not allowed to hunt access yes program. A lot of people don't realize that. The outfitters aren't allowed to hunt that unless they get permission specifically from the landowner that owns it to hunt. So the dissatisfaction, we get a lot of blame for dissatisfaction for those in sports because they won't access what we have. But we're taking care of it. We're not shooting it to ribbons. And then next door is 40,000 acres that's enrolled in access. Yes, that's 12 scared lawns.
And I'll just take that a step further, and that goes to more block management stuff, which makes it difficult for management. I get it, but we had a Fortification Creek Wilderness Study Task Force, wasn't quite this big, but it was made up of landowners and sportsmen, and it's a very large piece of public land that is inaccessible, has its own elk area. It's probably where most of the elk in northeastern Campbell County spawn from now, and that are running out of control. And that conversation really focused around that they have managed their deer area very good, and they have really big deer there. They're hard to get to. You have to, if you're going to actually access it without crossing private land, it's many, many miles of to get there. And so, but once you're in there, you're into 60,000 acres of public land. They didn't want to allow any access into that. When I say the 5, 6, 7, 8 landowners that in 3 different counties that border that don't want to, what they would say, ruin that because of a general area. And so, the conversation at those task force meetings was with Game and Fish. If they're allowed to have access, if there's more public access, are you going to block manage? Are you gonna be able to block manage that? And I don't know that was ever answered, but it was also gonna be very tough to answer.
So, again, pardon my naivete, is that because if you did allow, if there was access, it would just be flooded with so many people versus if it was more selective, carve out, limited for that type draw,
Right.
then it would be more manageable. So it's an option then to explore.
Well, it would be,
Blocks
it would, I mean, what Sai's talking about, what I'm talking about is that you'd have smaller areas of public land that's accessible that would have to be block managed through some sort of limited quota or something, I mean, it would have to be done something like that. Otherwise you're going to, you're gonna run into the issues that Sai was saying, that it'll get overhunted.
Those tools already exist. I mean, we've got one in the Red Desert. It's an access yes program, HMA, but the landowners specify only X number of hunters. I hunted on the Pitchfork HMA up there in 58. They only allow so much. You got to sign up with the department, like the one in the Red Desert. That's a lot of redraw to get into that. So that's a negotiated agreement between the landowner and the department. So I think those tools already exist. One guy doesn't, maybe he wants you to run all the elk on to the neighbor's place.
Well, I think the elk, they're okay with elk. They don't want the deer to mess with.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things, you let somebody on to hunt elk and they hunt deer, and that's why those areas have had a different season date than when the deer season's going on, because they don't want any of those kind of issues.
Yeah, and that is the issue that we see on a lot of the areas that have unlimited numbers, is they don't want elk, as an example. They don't want elk on the ranch, so they want it shot to ribbons. And then there's other places where they want to limit it, and so they got, you got to put in for drawing. You get a permission slip for a certain set of dates, and we've even done those agreements not only with private land, but we've done it with Office of State Lands. We've got 2 areas in Laramie Peak where Office of State Lands purchased deeded ground, wanted to manage that for a certain number of hunters so that it wasn't just open free for all. That's worked very well. We've got 200 management areas that have worked there. If you draw, it's a really good opportunity.
So are there islands like that that are currently managed for the block system? And if they switch to more of a limited quota, that you might actually end up with more access?
They're termed wildlife management areas. So, I mean, there's a terminology for them.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Thanks, Rusty. So it sounds like, and I'm trying to pick it up here, but it sounds like there's really the two big issues. One is the monetary resources available to help entice and encourage more private landowners to enter into these types of access programs. But then the other issue where we could maybe compete is by providing types of services. Now, whether that's people that can work with blocks of properties to manage them, whether that's helping manage access of individuals, doing biological surveys, helping with range management. It sounds like those are the two areas where we could compete better, but I have to imagine, maybe the director can answer this, it's all resource constrained. So to do that, where do those resources come from? We can build great programs, but somebody's either got to run them and got to have the people to do that, or we have to be able to write the check to the landowner. So we should really be thinking about how we pay for that as a solution.
Sell more non-resident elk licenses.
I was thinking bonus points for sheep and for bison, but
You're gonna be talking that one. Thank you, Joe. Wayne's got an idea to offer up.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Oh, hang on just a second, Albert.
I
okay,
thought about this when we were putting this together. The 90-10 on elk, deer and antelope, which I'm not in favor. But if it does go through, there is a block of licenses there. The landowners that I'm referring to in my report are resident landowners. Resident landowners. So if we did issue licenses to ranches that qualify, and it spells out almost everything you suggested when you read this, then that is a source of revenue. Now, granted, a large percentage of those licenses would probably go to non-resident hunters. So the game and fish isn't going to lose most of that revenue. They're going to get it back. So there is a source.
Wayne, I think, help to clarify, and maybe I got confused with how this is tied to the, where's the money coming from or going to?
Well, if this task force makes the recommendation to go with the 90-10, which I don't favor, that ends up becoming a possibility. There's going to be, according to the information I got, 9,700 licenses going to residents. That's a pretty good chunk of resident licenses. The landowners, resident landowners should be considered in that pool of licenses.
Mr. Chairman,
And so then they could, are you saying that then they could sell them to the,
Certainly, but I'm saying if that license, that landowner sold some of those licenses or issued licenses to non-residents, that license would then go back to a non-resident license.
So I think the question that we would ask is, to get to the issue. Let me see if I can put this succinctly. Would you support transferable landowner tags if we change the allocation to 90-10?
no.
That's not. All right, I missed.
That's kind of where I was thinking too.
Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, so I lost it because.
That's what I thought you were trying to do.
When I,
I'm saying if it does go there,
yeah,
and we are still wrestling with the landowner license, there is that possibility of having licenses.
So let's ask both questions.
well, wait, let me make sure that the mechanism is clear. But I think what you're saying is that the landowners can have transferable tags. There might be extra demand from non-residents if they're ticked because of the 90-10, because they've lost that access. And so the revenue could come from selling, the landowners selling their landowner tags to those non-residents because there was that demand that needs to be met through 80-20.
No, I'm not talking about the 2 landowner taxes.
No, if you would be additional, yeah. Right. So how, who gets paid for what? You have to iron out of where the landowner is getting the benefit and where the commission or the would be getting the benefit of the non-resident price, but we can chew on it. Pat, what do you want to?
Mr. Chairman, so I'm gonna take off my other half of my red shirt. Because I will forever be banned by Game and Fish for making the statement I'm about to make.
We're used to it.
The Game and Fish Commission has been very frugal, very conservative. And the Game and Fish has funds to consider alternative proposals like we're talking about that are not tied to 90-10 and not tied to some major change. I mean, the commission has been incredibly conservative with spending sportsman dollars and takes that incredibly seriously. So they have some discretionary funds that might be accessed if the commission approves it and the department agrees to do some of the things we're talking about. And part of that funding has come because we keep electing Democratic presidents, which causes every person to run out and buy every 22 long rifle they can find on the face of the earth, which causes an influx of what are called Pittman Robertson dollars flowing in. And I think some of the things we're talking about would probably be Pittman Robertson eligible. And if that's true, then the feds via this Pittman Robertson fund could possibly pay 75% of the expenditures the department might make on some of these programs. So rather than do something, I'm sorry, Dwayne, but rather than do something crazy like vote for 90-10, which I'm never going to vote for, let's think a little bit more broadly and maybe try to see what other funds might be available to fund some of these good ideas.
Appreciate that. Albert's got his hand up permanently. I appreciate that. And I captured youth discretionary funds to pay for some of these projects and clarifying it's mostly Pittman Robertson money that could be used for that. All right, go ahead, Albert.
So thank you. And this kind of ties in, well, actually, I've been texting Crank. And it kind of ties in with a thought I have, which is to create an endowment. I've had like lots of these thoughts, right? We put endowment money towards education, Joe, right? The last few days. We're looking at the Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund. But what Crank just said, if you could do a matching endowment program, so make that a bill to the state to go, hey, Game and Fish is willing to put in whatever that is, X number of dollars into this endowment for hunting access. State, would you be willing to do it in this time where we have major surplus? So, and maybe it's a 75-25, maybe it's the department 75, state 25. But, you know, make it as appealing as you can. But I do think there's an opportunity there. I think it's, and I'm going to be honest, you got to compete. You may not compete in every area with every outfitter, but the fact of the matter is you are going to have to compete with outfitters for those dollars. And a lot of these old ranchers, at least some of them, if you limit the amount of who's coming in, they'll go with some of the general public because they live in those towns, right? These are people that they go to the grocery store with. You know, if they can get paid to do a little of that and not have to get money from an outfitter, I think they would do it. It's not going to work everywhere, but I think it's worth trying. So some combination program, Game and Fish state, to create an endowment.
Thanks, Albert. Any other new ideas that are just really bubbling up and we want the group to be thinking about?
You know, I really think Larry and Josh and Adam, I think everybody's talked about this, but really asking a big ask from sportsmen to say, hey, what are you willing to give to get access to So some of this block public land or some of this, what are they, because ultimately, nothing's gonna pass legislature or, you know, the eyes of the public if the sportsmen are across the board opposed to this. And so I think that's, you know, that's really what we're asking of the sportsmen is what, you know, what, or are you, you know?
I think,
Go ahead, Wayne.
I think, in order for the public to buy, the resident, public to buy into this, they're gonna have to see the details. And I don't think this group is gonna be able to do those details. In one of my program designs says a team made up of 2 resident landowners, 2 private land outfitters, appropriate game and fish people, director, access program, yes, and a game warden, a biologist. That kind of a number to address some of the things that we've talked about today. And come back with something that they think will work or won't work at all.
So often what I encourage groups to do is to kind of brainstorm a lot of possibilities as a large group. And then to do the straw design in little divisions. So we could even do in a room right now of, all right, this team, let's hash out some ideas around this topic and this team do a different one. We might be able to do that with issue number 2. If we brainstorm some more options, we can have a small group work on that. Today we're in December, and it could be an efficient way to work in a smaller group on details that are cumbersome for a large group, and then bring it back to share. Ogden, what do you want to add?
I'm gonna head down that crank route. Mine's gonna be just out on that whole world baby. I'm gonna kick back a little on what Rusty had to say. We keep kicking back to sportsmen on whether we look at any type of the other tags. The truth is, it's the public of Wyoming. And when you get to big chunks of landlocked ground, I'm sorry, it really doesn't totally deal with just Wyoming sports. It deals with the state of Wyoming and their people. And there's some decisions that may get made that aren't necessarily palatable to sportsmen because they're just not willing to deal at all. There's no give on it. But it really does. The game of Wyoming and what's there goes far beyond just sportsmen. It goes to all other levels of it. And it affects game and fish directly. It affects state lands and their end of it. And I think we've outsized, and I'm going to get the heck beat out of me for this, but we've outsized the role of these, 10, 12% of Wyoming in sports. We're allowing them to make the decisions for the entire state of Wyoming. And that's really not who this is all about. It's about game and management. And that goes beyond outfitters, sportsmen, and private landowners. It is, how do we look at the big picture and do what's right for the game herds and the people of Wyoming? That encompasses all those groups I just gave, but it shouldn't give any of them an exclusive end on where it's at. Sportsmen should necessarily have a lot bigger say on the big blocks of public ground. Big blocks of private ground, it really doesn't matter how mad sportsmen want to get. It's not going to change how they get managed and what happens. So how do we make it where they work better for all of us? Because that's, like I said, I'm gonna get some arrows thrown at this because it looks like I'm trying to bully them, but the truth is, what's the number it's been given? 10%, 12%, 18% of us are sportsmen. There's a lot more out there in the whole state.
Appreciate the reminder of the global perspective, right? That
Yeah.
sometimes we get hyper focused on something and the bigger perspective.
Well, and I think we're in fear of that, is we get pushed because you've got the sportsman group that's pushing it. And you've got a landowner group on the other side, particularly big ones, which, by the way, aren't represented in here. Outfitters probably come as close as there is. They really aren't represented in this group. But the truth is, to be honest, they don't care. They got big enough blocks, they manage their operations. These really big ones, they're managed. Outfitters might represent them a little bit, but they're gonna do it regardless what decision we make here. We can tell them to go to hell. You know what? They're gonna go right on running the ranch just the way they are now, and there's still no access to anything. And there's still game problems centered around these ranches. Some of them too much game, some of it with access problems to other areas. So let's really globally look at this and how do we do it and not run in fear because one group is either whatever their reasoning, because what I'm seeing is sportsmen are saying hell or high water. We don't want to see landowners, particularly large landowners, to have any kind of way to enter into the management. That was the point when we tried to do this task force. Is how do we come up with joint partnerships? That's a win-win. I care about the game, folks. You know, I'm telling you where I live, and it's a tough deal. I care about the game more than I care about the people. Sorry.
I think you highlighted, and I'm just, oh wait, that's issue 2. We started our issue 3 list of interest last time, I believe. But I'm just gonna clarify, when I look back at the end, the partnerships. Whatever we do around this, it seems like working through partnerships. And also, I know you highlighted before incentives. Because you do have those private property rights, right? And people are gonna do what they need to do, whether that's running their ranch operation as a leisure ranch where they can admire the wildlife, or as a working ranch with cattle and sheep or whatever else. So how do you incentivize them to willingly want to do these things that are good for the wildlife? I am feeling our energy starting to droop. And it's appropriate given the time. I wonder if we take a quick break and then come back and have some public comment on issue 3, landowner stuff. Is that all right? Let's go one more comment before we go on break, and then we'll clarify what we're going to do.
Another person that I asked him and his son hunted some white-tailed does on the interior was a former game warden from Mexico. Also the Fish and Wildlife like Wyoming. We had a pretty good conversation about their land program. He said it works very well. He gave me some specifics of why, but one of the things he said was the relationship between game and fish and landowners who really started ranching for wildlife as well as cattle really improved tremendously. I'd like to throw that out there. It can work.
So I just want to see those stuff that they're ready or not. We need a break.
Yeah, we need a short break. Yeah.
Let's take a short break, and then when we come back, do you want to go back to number 2?
Do we have something that's still presenting?
I don't know
I
if it's
just-
presenting or public comment.
I just told him to wait till December 3rd because it's too late. So thank you, sir. So we have to do this.
Hang on. Yes, can we come back? We're doing public comments and Chair, you want to do public comments on issue 3?
Yeah.
All right, public comment on issue 3 when we come back. Thank you. Come on back. Appreciate everybody's energy today with helping further develop the story, identify some possible options. I started to capture some of your interest, but I think
All right,
it's a good time to hear from the public. We've got one person online and one in the present crowd. Rusty, who do we have in the room? Where's that first?
Dusty Porter.
Dusty.
I'm not gonna be able to make the next meeting, so figure out to speak my piece on a couple of matters, things you guys were talking about, so. like the idea of respecting people, including Rusty, that says, tying the landowner license and access. Around here, that's our largest issue with respects to elk. It's, tons of elk. I think we're well over population objective. It doesn't matter how many licenses you put on there. It's elk right now, so some of them have enough money where they can just go buy a commissioner's tag every year. They don't really care about their landowner licenses, but it seems like if we could tie those two together, it might take care of a couple of problems. I also like the idea, I think Ogden decided to this, but I think we need to focus on the usage. I think sometimes we get hung up on the amount of acreage. Really should be the usage. I think that's the biggest thing. And then today, as well as a couple of previous meetings, there's a couple times it's kind of up that, landowners shouldn't be getting type 1 bull or buck tags, and that we should incentivize them with doe or cow gap tags. That's no incentive for a landowner. They're not going to put up with the headache of letting people on their property to give them those licenses. A lot of those licenses are the ones that are undersubscribed for anyway. They're 100% put in for a cow calf or a doe tag. There are a lot of those licenses that go to the leftover draw, so it's of no benefit to the landowner. And then there's also another topic that was brought up about hunting animals only on your land when they were there. I guess I would just ask if it's a good management idea to be killing animals May or March or April. That probably doesn't make a lot of sense. I think we have to remember is Wyoming Wildlife is very migratory. So currently where it sits, where you can hunt the entire unit, I think that makes a lot of sense as opposed to being restricted to your deeded ground only. And then very much in favor of closing those corporate loopholes. Obviously, size example of 5,400 people being eligible for tags. That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So just wanted to throw those in front of you, and thanks for your time. Any questions for Dusty? Dusty, you are a landowner, right? Correct. Do you take landowner license? We do receive licenses.
Do you allow public access?
We do allow public access. We were a charter member of the HMA program. Started in 2001.
Nice.
Thank you.
We have one on
Great.
online.
All right, we have Wyatt coming in.
Y'all hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Wyatt.
Awesome. Thanks for letting me put a bug in your ear here at the end of the day. This is basically a caste system we have for tags going on, where the opportunities you have access to depend on the family that you happen to be born into, or people can buy an opportunity.
Hang on, Wyatt, your audio is really spotty. Just a second. Let's see if we can fix something here.
Choppy,
Yeah.
it's choppy.
Cam, we just need to pause for like 2 minutes. Is that okay?
Yep.
Talk amongst yourselves, see if you have any other
Sorry.
brilliant ideas on this landowner issue. I was just telling my favorite moment. We always know the tech solution shut it off and turn it back on again. And one of my favorite moments of this is when Tony said, "You have to wait 10 seconds. You have to wait 10 seconds."
That's my one tech solution. for
That's the one
everything.
tech solution for everything, but you gotta give it
Turn it
time.
off.
Wyatt, thanks for your patience. We're just getting our speaker restarted.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
All right, try again, Wyatt. Let's see if that's better on our side.
Any better?
Yes.
No broken speech. All right. Yeah, I just said this is kind of basically a caste system we have for tags, where the opportunities you have access to depend on the family you happen to be born into, or
Wait. Do I do it again, Megan?
What does Mississippi do?
Don't mess with that.
I think it's just,
This blue light is flashing in a new and exciting way.
yeah. That's the way for it.
It's a busy day today.
Okay. Can you hit the mode button on that thing until I tell you to stop?
Is the, oh, yep.
Again? No, okay.
Oh, I hit one more.
No, no, no. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Okay, sorry. All right. I think we're not good. What?
That was a dramatic lead up and no reflection of you. That's all on us.
Thank you for trying so hard to hear me. Can you hear me?
We can. Quick,
Okay.
get it done before we lose you again.
Third time's a charm. Here we go. Okay, I said this is basically a caste system we have for our tags where the opportunities you have access to depend on the family you happen to be born into, or in this case, some people can buy into that opportunity by buying some land. I would argue that wildlife managers or habitat managers should be given tags. They arguably do more for our wildlife and are not given tags, regardless of what some people think when Wyoming Game and Fish Department employees draw tough tags. Why do landowners deserve these incentives over everyone else that owns the wildlife? Speaking of incentives, landowners that have game have hunters that want access. Those hunters pay trespass fees. They pay guide fees. Landowners can get money through the Access Yes program. Landowners that like hunting have an exclusive place for themselves, friends, and family to hunt game. So incentives do exist. Transferable tags are an altogether appalling idea. Wildlife is a public resource. No private entity should be able to profit off a tag to harvest our game. They can already profit off of access to the game, but giving them a tag to sell is full-on privatization of wildlife, I think. These are not animals living in a high fence operation that can be sold to the highest bidder, where the ranch gets all the profit. This would likely just create more problems for management of wildlife by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. The more monetary interest private landowners have in wildlife, the more they engage in the management of the wildlife and hunters. I prefer to keep the Wyoming Game and Fish Department as the authority on management the best that we can. Please consider my comments from earlier meetings about public lands raising private wildlife as well. They're getting forage back to make up for the forage lost. Having land in Wyoming since the homesteading days has come with the expectation that there will be give and take associated with the wild aspects of the state. These days, it seems like everyone feels they're owed something. We shouldn't create boxes to determine who deserves what. Wildlife, in the way of highly sought after buck and bull tags, are a public resource, and we should all have equal opportunity to it. Again, if you decide you should give out coveted tags to landowners, please consider Wyoming Game and Fish Department Landowner of the Year recipients as the only landowners that may get buck or bull tags. There would be far fewer tags handed out. The same people may not get the tags year after year, and it would be a great competition for the tags that benefits wildlife, habitat, and sportsmen. In closing, I'll just say that in year 2 of a bad drought and looking at some of the rangelands, some folks' tag qualifications probably do need to be reassessed. When push comes to shove, providing wildlife habitat isn't a priority. Those are my comments. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Do you have any questions for Ryan? Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else on comment? Good, Megan?
No one else online.
Okay. So it's a little bit backwards, but before we move on, I've listed the actions we've come up with so far on the list, so those will be typed up in the minutes, and we'll send out the photos of the notes. And I'll add some of those. I think when Ogden was speaking earlier, There were some ideas that he was sharing that really fit under options that we could consider. Not just information gathering, but like, what if we did this? What if we did that? I will move those over. In thinking back to our conversation earlier about how options are a reflection of our values, I want to make sure that we identify some of our key values around these landowner issues. So I know we talked about partnerships, incentives. We want opportunity and access, right? Whatever we do, we hope that it improves opportunity and access. And we always want to preserve the well-being of herds. Thinking, and again, I encourage you to think about, like, Joe came up with his big 5 of kind of key criteria for any solutions on the big 5. What are some other values or interests that you think of? Not the specifics of what we're going to do, but like what's important about any solutions that we would consider? What kind of criteria would you want to apply to thinking about any other solutions?
Value of wildlife habitat.
Okay, so I have the well-being of herds. Sounds like there's an aspect of that that's like the habitat. The rich habitat, the best places where people want to live is also the best places with the resources that the animals want to live. Lisa, you had a hand up too.
Just a question, maybe because my brain is tired.
Can't imagine why. It's like,
Well, when I look at, I mean, the purpose of the task force, study top priority wildlife policy issues facing the state related to the allocation of hunting opportunity, sportsman access, and other issues. So I'm not sure of all of the landowner issues, which of the ones we should focus on. I mean, if it's the number of damage claims from grizzly bears, I don't know how to sort all of that into what our purpose is.
so I think
Does that
part
make
of that in that purpose statement is with the policy issues. To me, one of those big ones is access and opportunity. And so the habitat piece is, as controlled by landowners, is a big part of that. But I don't know as far as a manageable slice, what the best tools are for that. Does that make sense to folks? Is that just in terms of clarifying our purpose?
The 2 premises here, I think, that kind of brought us to this part of the discussion, or that identifying it as being one of the issues we tackle really were landowner licenses, and then Ogden's whole idea of how can we have more wildlife through incentives. I think those are the 2 things that got us to the table here.
I wish Ogden was here, because I question his statement on how you incentivize landowners to take care of their land for wildlife. If we don't incentivize landowners, or ranchers can quit working to have high quality forage and grass for their cattle. I mean, when he makes that statement, it has zero traction with me, because it seems like a backwards statement where we have to incentivize landowners to provide good habitat for wildlife.
Well, no, that's right. I was just gonna, I'm not sure I'm certainly not gonna speak for all.
Well, yeah, that's why I wish he was
But-
here. I've been trying to think about that statement since you
But,
made
you
it.
know, they could just sell the property,
Yeah.
you know, and that could get chopped up into 40s. No, and I don't know if that's where he's going with that, but I think that's been mentioned
So
in other aspects that we, you know, maybe Albert can speak a little bit more to that.
yeah, so here's the idea, right? If I run cows, right? I want to produce grass. I don't really care about forbs. I don't really care about shrubs. So is the best thing on my place to go in and beat all the sagebrush off to meet my objective of more grass? Is that necessarily good for mule deer and sage grouse, for example? So I think there are ways to to provide incentives, and it's been talked about for a long time. It's, is there a way to provide incentives to create more wildlife habitats? So where you create more biodiversity on your place for a myriad of species, it's still good for livestock, but it maybe isn't exclusive to livestock, right? It's not maximizing that piece of my place that would just be for cattle, for example. So, obviously I think there's a whole lot of things that could be done there. But I would assume that was what he was talking about, but I'm also not sure. And I think it also goes to that, obviously I've sold a conservation easement on my place because I believe firmly in preserving wildlife and agricultural into the future on my place. But there is that concept of term leases or term easements, and where we try to maintain those things that we want to see on the landscape for a period of time, and so a rancher doesn't subdivide. So those are a few things to think about.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to speak for Ogden either, but I've heard him say several times that he believes there are places where if we incentivized it, we could grow more wildlife. We could have more numbers, greater deer herds, greater elk herds. And I think that's what Ogden's going at with that, but he said that several times.
Let me give you an illustration of that because it happened back in the woods. It's called the Sierra Madre raised elk herd. And we watched that elk herd. Had a herd objective of 4,200 head. And at one point in time, we got up to between 12 to 14,000 head of elk. And it wasn't just the lost forage, it was the fence damage and all of these other things. And it was an absolute outpouring of the landowners that says, get your damn elk herd back down to objective. Now, we ended up with a little higher objective for that. The point being is that we had enough incentive. There's an elk herd right there that we know that we had, other than the really bad winners, that we have the carrying capacity. Probably on most winners at 10,000, 12 to 14 might be at suppose. If we incentivize those landowners enough, we could double the objectives in that elk herd. But right now, there is absolutely no incentive to put up on fence damage, forage law. I have got a whole bunch of landowners that look, I would reduce my stalking numbers if I could monetize the value of that wildlife. I would reduce those numbers, and there's a lot of incentives why they would want to do that. Because it's a consistent, steady income versus the vagaries of the cow market, and hay prices, and all of this other stuff. That is a herd level example that had there been significant, enough incentive for those landowners, primarily winter diesel, because they're all in the Forest Service. And the BLM also, the vast majority of them, they come winter and they come down there. I mean, it was a pretty tense time. That sweet spot probably almost double what the objective is as to what we could carry. There's no incentive to do that whatsoever. That's the big scale. That's a herd level scale.
Mr. Chairman, I think next to incentive, you have to put compensation, because I mean, that was a huge part of what you're talking about. And the same thing with Ogden, whether you agree with it or not, that's a topic.
And I think about Pete, it could also look like services. When you talked about kind of the biological services and managing grass, rangeland management, grass, prairie dogs, right? Some of those different things. It doesn't have to just be financial, but you've got to have some sort of carrot that helps folks tolerate.
Chairman, sort of to Dwayne's article, and I think one thing that we put as an interest is our Wyoming way of culture. We value the ranchers and the people, the history of Wyoming, people that have been here. And what I fear, and I'm not a rancher, but is breakup of the farms because people can't agree. One person wants to work, one person doesn't, and that's an interest we all. I think a lot of us we have to say we want to preserve our Wyoming way of life. We don't want to become bought out by the billionaires and the millionaires or family farms and ranches. And that's where it's tricky with the landowner tags and where we start monetizing them and have people come in and try to buy the land for that purpose. But it's just, I think historical and cultural way of life for Wyoming is a real important interest to us.
Yeah, I think about that preservation of the landscape and that working land aspect of it. It's made me think of food. Like, we need food. It doesn't matter if it's elk or it's cow. if we, wipe out all of our agricultural lifestyle, we gotta eat something.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if we've said it quite clear enough, but I think one of the interests is recognition of the significant contribution that private lands provide to our public wildlife.
Wouldn't have them without them.
I've said the first day of this meeting, when times are tough, particularly on winter, during the winter, 90% of our wildlife live on private lands. And without them supporting those, we wouldn't have the herds we have. So it's just recognition of that fact.
It also bears noting that during the spring, summer, early fall months, a lot of our public lands keep private cattle's bellies full also. So there's a flip on that too, that if we're going to acknowledge one, we've got to acknowledge the other.
I agree with that 100%. Those guys pay for that privilege to go get that public forage. Nobody's paying that landowner for that public wildlife to come and eat their forage. So I agree with you. They do go out there and they pay for that privilege. So if you want the extension of that argument, is they start paying on a per head AUM basis on the private for what they consume there. So
Compensatory to the market rate that they're paying on public ground for lease. The private lease and public lease, there's a pretty drastic monetary difference between the two.
yeah, that's a whole other discussion. So it's just that we won't get into it.
So again, we can acknowledge the benefit going both ways, although the scale and nature of it, because
There's something to be said probably to a lot of public lands that are focused to multi-use, and that's multi-use year round. I go back to a couple things from today that I just kind of thought about is, did anybody notice besides Josh and I that in Diane's presentation today, that agriculture wasn't even a blip anywhere in there unless that was a mistake. There was agriculture wasn't even listed in the economy of Wyoming. I know I'm not saying it's not, but it must be so small that it didn't register.
Well, she mentioned cattle drives, or they bring,
Dude ranches.
they do ranches and cattle.
Not what we're thinking of with that.
But we've talked about how
I disagree with you, Justin. She may not have specifically mentioned it, but when she mentioned recreation and wildlife and views and all that open space,
that is agriculture.
that's the commodity that they provide. The people come to see that, right?
I get it.
It just wasn't specifically in agriculture.
That's right.
It makes up about 2.2% of the state GDP. Ag does.
And so I guess my other point, she talked about mountain biking and all that kind of thing. Somebody else talked about mountain biking and that impact is some of those impacts that it's going to bring to some of our public lands. That also helps push some of those wildlife onto private land at certain times when they wouldn't normally, like Adam said, they'd normally be probably on those public lands, but now here we're going to have more multi-use and more people using it. I don't know whether that goes into this discussion. I just thought it was an interesting tying some of that stuff together today.
And unfortunately, some of that's out of our scope because we're talking about federal lands.
Yeah, I think the lease has got us going on the right track on this. Is how do we tie this back to the original charge? What we, as a task force, were being asked to come up with. Where does this fit within that realm? So that we can then take that information and ask for feedback, because this is, I don't know how we do that.
Well, I think Larry tried to bring different actual specific things up, and I appreciate that. How do you fund more? How do we help give some recommendations to fund access? Yes. How do we give recommendations for what Dwayne wants to? Is there some give and take on what we can recommend for public use to access land, and not just land? It's got to be land with that hunters want access. It doesn't do any good to get access to to nothing. But, and what are they willing to give up to help with the management on private land? And I think, those are the things that we're gonna struggle with probably for the next few months, but,
That preference points.
yeah.
Well, see, along those lines, and I'm gonna go back to the Sierra Madre. I would absolutely love to be able to go, because we're talking a handful of landowners that want a significant number. And be able to go down there and say, what could we do that would help you guys? That would improve your tolerance to raise the herd objective from 6,000 to 9,000 in the Sierra Madres. What that does? Access to wildlife, revenue for the department. What does that take for those landowners to tolerate 9,000 head of elk, 10,000 head of elk? Because I can tell you, we can carry those elk if the landowners can tolerate it. But right now, they just won't. And here's the sad thing, the only time they won't is about 1 out of 10 years. The 9 years that we have normal, the average, and maybe slightly above that is not a problem. So that 1 out of 10 years drives the whole population decision to keep those elk down around 6,000, 6,500. When we've known we've had as many as 12 to 14,000. And so what would that be something we want to put out there? What would it take for a group of landowners to consider actually going to raising a herd objectives? Is that not a discussion that's worth having?
I think it's really a very good conversation to have, especially if we move that from elk to mule.
I was gonna say, I don't think anybody's clamoring for more else, although.
But you're right. I think just in my neck of the woods, the Powder River, those guys would, in fact, when I told him how many, texted him and told him how many mule deer does were shot in 2020, he's like, bring those to the Powder River, 3,000 mule deer does shot in 2020. I don't think most people realize that culture of not shooting a doe mule deer it's not, I just think that's 3,000 too many. Now I get there's some damage and that's why I asked about the damage, what that number was, but I think there's landowners there that would be willing to raise animals.
And is this an opportunity where we look at the tool that Rick King had mentioned with the Wyoming Survey and Analysis Center at the university to be able to compile something that could be used to garner that information through a variety of landowners and that stakeholder representation? Maybe that's, I think he mentioned that there was potentially 2 surveys that could be utilized.
Exactly.
To me, that's a tool that
We already have the contract in place and we're ready to go.
we should use.
The turnaround time though was like 6-8 weeks or something.
Probably, yeah.
So
Before you can get that.
We have plenty
We've
of
got
time
plenty to
on
talk
this
about while we
subject.
wait for the answers.
So this is Albert, one last comment. So, it's not only about, can you get landowners to do certain things? It's also about educating the new landowners. And there's a lot of assumptions maybe that the new landowners are all about wildlife. Even the ones that don't subdive, they're all about wildlife. They're gonna know what's best and they're gonna find out. And I tell you, I've got a billionaire down the river from me. That's my understanding. He's gonna put a buck fence nearly the length of that ranch running north and south when I know there's an east and west deer migration. Now, how much sense does that make? He probably doesn't even know that. I don't, there needs to be more, and I know this is on a variety of issues, and I know we've mentioned this, but there needs to be a lot more attempt at educating the new landowners on what exists on their places. They may not want to know and they may not care. But I think that's an important thing as well.
Thank you.
And then the one other thing, and I see it starting to happen here a little bit, this friction between hunter and rancher, and I'm both, right? Been that way my whole life. I'm a hunter and a rancher. Is I guarantee you in the end, we have more commonalities than we have differences. And I just think that's good to remember.
We have an answer
I was gonna ask Brian, on some of these in area 7 and 19, how much, if the objectives, the herd objectives are way below the number of elk that we have. The deer objectives are way below what they should be, but the elk population is way above. How much have we approached some of these large landowners that are, where all the elk are congregating, how much have we done to try to visit with them a little bit about what they're creating, what problems and what solutions? And I think it's a great idea to get these people together, but again, if they don't care, it just creates I would think it would be great if we could do that, but man, we're never, and we've tried some things. We've got a late small bull because of the bull cow ratio in area 7. We've got a late season that begins the 21st of November, runs all the way till the end of the year, to try to take some small bulls, 4 points on the side or fewer, to try to eliminate some of those bulls, so you could maybe get closer to that number of bulls per cow. And for years they've started hunting cows and calves the 15th of August all the way up to the 1st of the year, and we still got way too many elk. So we're trying different things, but it still boils down to how do we get these landowners that have the large holdings to work with the game and fish and work with the public to do what's best for wildlife and what's best for the numbers that the game and fish sees. So
Well, I'll answer a little bit of that.
okay.
Each year, a lot of the biologists in certain areas do go visit with those people because they're trying to get those numbers harvested. And if you know how to make that work, that would be great.
I like to.
They have a very difficult time.
It
because
is.
They don't have to do anything you say. And those are their own. I mean, you'd be surprised the number of people there, they just think it's their own like private herd. They come, the same elk come back to their ranch every year. I'd like to have them. And it's a very, very difficult situation, but they do try.
And I think they do. I'm not saying that the game and fish hadn't tried, because I know talking with game and fish and the local game warden, they work very hard to try to get access.
If they're landowners next to the forest or somewhere where there's grazing, to try to let them know that those elk go back to the forest and they're destroying willow, they're destroying aspen, they're doing all that. Trying to do a lot of different ideas to try to get them incentivized to let them hunt. So maybe make a youth hunt, a lot of different ideas they try to throw in.
Just introduce the wolf stuff.
So is there?
Don't take care of your health problem.
I wanted to know, I captured, I think coming back to that, I think we want to have a holistic view and interrelation of things, but also targeted solutions that like go to where the problem is. Some of these things could be statewide, and in other places it's like, you've got to be working on the ground in specific nuanced ways. So we target, we're gonna
I watched today, I'm gonna say a really dirty word.
Right.
You ready?
Right.
Landowners set aside licenses. I watched Wayne almost choke before he said it. Rusty just paused before he said it. We just need to be candid and throw that stuff out there. That's a riot. Let's just recognize it. That's gonna cause a big discussion and a riot or insurrection or whatever you want to call it.
We already have landowners set aside
It's
licenses.
a big deal to formally recognize it maybe. So let's just be comfortable talking about those things, because we're not gonna come to any solutions unless we can say the words and talk about the issues.
The other thing I think we need to throw out there, and at some point we probably, I hope we get a presentation on it, but we hear all of these elk issues, and then those elk issues, I believe, are playing into our deer issues, our mule deer issues. And there's gotta be some education statewide to those landowners that don't realize that them keeping that many elk on certain ranches or really statewide, they don't maybe know the impact that that's having on mule deer herds statewide. And so there's probably some education that needs to be happening. That has happened through our task force. Just in general, us having this discussion, these discussions, people are listening and people are reading about it. People are sportsmen are commenting on it. And so having that discussion, I think, is important too, because that's going to play into helping with maybe some management issues and maybe some things down the line with helping some habitat issues with our mule deer and not getting out competed by a larger animal. So I don't know when we're going to do that, but hopefully it's sometime in the next couple months.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this with the target setting, and how we're able to meet targets and everything, being mindful of the management versus policy side of it. But it sounds like there's an element of this of, as you're incentivizing landowners to tolerate larger herds, and on the flip side, how do we make sure that we can take out the animals you need to take out from management goals so that they are not getting too large? Sounds like it's a both and question on that. I'm gonna leave these interests as they are, and invite us to chew on these possibilities. I don't know if any of you, Albert, I think you're connected with the Western Landowners Alliance. Anybody else have familiarity with that group? They, their most recent publication, they put out this beautiful magazine, and the last issue was all about landowner hunter issues, and talking about poaching and trespass and incentives. And anyway, I just encourage you to check out that publication, because I read through the whole thing. I was like, this is the task force, like all the way through, and they do really good work, and perhaps their staff to be a resource in offering some guidance in terms of their, I know that's part of the work incentives, and what are the mechanisms to do that and fund it, and it's just a good resource.
Did you send that out in a link?
I did not. I can see what's available online. I got the print publication. Full transparency, my husband's research at the university is all on conservation of private land. So this is an area that I'm familiar with through his research and through his connections with Western Landowners Alliance. That publication came to our mailbox, so that's a piece to be aware of. So I can look and see what is online and send it out to you all, because I found myself into the task force over and over. It's good to know this quality stuff. Anything else before we move on to our next steps? All right. I have identified some questions for next time. And I just want to turn to Damon Fish and make sure this is a reasonable thing. We're not going to pursue this issue of the leftover draw going to residents first. But the possibility to add the pop-up, I know we are going to have some folks check on. How about this one? Wanted some information, Brian, about lands purchased for tags. Is there any data we can get as far as how widespread this
We'll just give it
problem
a try. I don't know. I mean, I could go as an example or an illustration. I can look at a lot of it. Real estate advertisements have that in there.
is? Okay.
Get 2 landowner tags by it, comes with 2 landowner tags.
Right. Okay, so we can get a sense. I think people want to know kind of the magnitude of the problem, and I'll take pictures and send these to you too, Jen. So don't really give a talk about. There was also a question of what type of land the tags go to. Again, thinking about maybe abuse in the system, or are they really fulfilling their purpose? I don't know if there's any sort of fancy GIS of like landowner tags and what the land cover is, or what type of habitat it looks like. Is that something that?
I don't know.
Okay. Put a question mark on it and be realistic. In 2 weeks with Thanksgiving in the middle, no pressure. We have a question on habitat. I'll take this one. I know a guy. A publication coming out from Reckle House in the past, perhaps, about habitat and private lands. I don't know what's most updated, but I'll take that one. More information on access, yes. Albert asked for more information on access, yes. I know you got a explainer video. I think this question came from Albert. Albert, was there a specific question you had about access, yes, or just to
No,
direct
I
the-
think it might have got answered in the middle of it is, I believe, but I wasn't sure that you could tailor access yes to a myriad of circumstances. If that's not the case, then that's something that needs to be looked at. In other words, I thought you could do it down to one individual. I mean, I talked about a youth moose tag on my place at one time. And so I just want to make sure it has as much flexibility as possible. And I think probably the answer I heard today was yes, but I'm not sure of that.
If it can't be, then we probably should know what kind of recommendations we need to make to who.
It can be.
Okay.
Those things can be tailored in any way the landowner wants, basically. It's in the law.
Brian, kind of tying to that, do we know what kind of revenue's been generated from the increase in the conservation stamp? Do we have any projection on what 20?
We do, it's 1.6 million a year, once it's fully implemented. 1.3 of that going to access, and then the other balance of that will be crossings and fish passage.
And then one last place where I highlighted how many damage claims come from non-residents. That's something that you all can parse. I don't know how.
I don't know that it's informative, because we have like actual traditional ranches
Yeah.
that have been family-run ranches for decades, but they're owned by somebody from out of state. I mean, I know several places like that that are, I think what we would all think of as kind of resident-run ranches, because
Right.
they're in ag production, and so I don't know that we glean a lot out of
It'd be a little artificial to separate it that way. Okay, I don't remember who asked that question.
No, that's fair.
Yeah,
Alright.
that's true.
Any other information requests before we come into our December meeting? I feel like in December, there's gonna be a lot of chewing on, and what about this and what about that? And if there's missing gaps, acknowledging the limitations of a really fast turnaround in Thanksgiving.
Brian, if this isn't fair, you can push back, but I really want to know how you determine who gets landowner licenses and how do you enforce that?
So we can do that. So make sure you capture that, Todd, and then we will come with a presentation on just how everything goes, how the steps go, what methods we use to determine use days, all the intricacies of landowner licenses. We do that. It's pretty
And
easy.
then, I guess the other part of that is suggestions, how maybe we might change that. But you're the one running it.
Yeah, we've got some ideas that our internal group came up with, and then I think a lot of what we're gonna hear from Jim McGagnon is gonna be similar to some of this, but he'll probably have some new ideas too, so.
So I captured those information needs, we'll send those out in a picture. Here's what I have for next steps. Typing up an emailing language for the changes to preference points. So I wrote it up here, I sent it to Todd. Is that your job? It's been circulated, so
Yeah.
it's taken care of?
Well, it's been modified.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the next step. That's your last to do list is already done. Collect public comments on the proposed changes. All of you are gonna do that. And December 3rd is our deadline of that, and we're coming together. Is there time to revise the website and collect online feedback for this in a targeted way?
For which one?
For public comment on issue 1, the preference point for the big five.
As soon as we have that language done, I can put it in the forum.
Okay.
But I just want to make sure it's the right language for you all.
There's a few of them floating around out there on an email chain, so.
What
we'll
is-
have to you shorten it.
By 5 o'clock tomorrow, if you have any comments, you're late.
I was thinking of like a November 29th deadline on the comment form or something, but I don't know. I have to talk to my folks who will be handling it.
Yeah. So I'm gonna say maybe by November 19th, it can be online, but remind folks that there's an early deadline, so that those, that feedback can be gathered together. Everyone needs to review information that was sent out about elk regionalization and the technology for a fair chase. Bring any questions that I didn't have about those for December 3rd meeting. The bulk of December 3rd is going to be finishing, hallelujah, issue 1 in the reference point conversation. And then digging into your options for issue 2 and now issue 3 as well. That's what we're really going to be focusing on. Any other next steps that we need to make sure we catch? All right. So one next step that I think many of you are aware of is that our favorite logistical genie, Megan, has found a new job and is moving to Oregon. And it's so sad. So sad. I'm super excited for her. So can you join me in thanking Megan for her service to the task force? Megan, the task force has a card for you. We will hopefully not feel Megan's absence too deeply in December, but we will have a lot of grace. And I can tell you, I've worked with a lot of people that handle the logistics that Megan does, and she is really, really good. So I have full faith in our game and fish folks for the ways that they'll continue, and we will stay ahead. But I also know that we will feel her absence and she'll be back. Any other questions or closing thoughts for the good people before we wrap up today?
Just one thing, I won't be here for the next meeting. I'm going to try to get in remotely. But that all depends on whether I'm successful in finding a sheep in New Mexico. If you don't see me online, you'll know that I wasn't successful in finding the sheep. That's cool.
Charles, another announcement?
Let's put 90-10 on your elk
You think that was an accident?
Another announcement.
Just one quick logistics thing. Yeah, hotel training, get them tonight.
Yeah, for December 3rd, if you need a hotel, they get tonight. It's last day.
It's gonna be a really quick turnaround on.
Yeah, another thing, we're gonna try to, again, try to have a forum the night before in Casper. And so that's one thing I think we may end up using, just so we know we have a place to just use your regional office.
Well, just need to check as far as COVID and public.
We're good with using the regional office as long as it's not already booked. And we will pay if we need to do it here. We've got funds to pay for a meeting room for something that's important like this.
Okay, that's one thing. And then the other thing is my thing is really full, so I'd ask Todd if they have extra 3-ring binders to bring maybe some more, so we can put all the public comments in one and maybe all the other stuff in another.
Simple.
So that's something I already asked. Other than that, thanks for everything and all your patience with us. Congratulations.
All right. You guys say go home, everybody. Thank you so much.
Well,